My name is Diarmuid O'Flynn. I'm a member of the Ballyhea Says No to Bank Debt campaign group. For the last 120 weeks, that's 2 years, 3 months, 3 weeks and counting, every week, and in tandem with our friends and neighbours from the Charleville Says No campaign group, we've been marching in protest against the imposition of private bank debt on the people of Ireland. We have marched in fair weather and in foul. We have marched in great numbers and in small. We are young, we are venerable, we are male, we are female, we are entire families. In the past 120 weeks, we have taken our campaign up and down the country, from east in Bray to west in Castlebar, from south in Ballyhea to north in Donegal. We've gone to the Dáil, we've gone to Brussels, we've even gone to the ECB headquarters itself in Frankfurt, where we nailed the Ballyhea thesis to the door, a symbolic reenactment of what Martin Luther had done in Germany nearly 400 years earlier in protest at the abuse of power by the major European institution of that period. We are just a small voice, joined now by other small voices in various centres throughout the country in the Ireland Says No campaign. A representation of all Ireland, of every section and element of this society. Our cause, however, is great, and the justice of that cause is what sustains us. Our case is clear and concise. However, and by whoever it was done, we reject the imposition of private bank debt on the Irish people. Our campaign is equally clear and concise. However, and by whoever it is done, we want to see a write-off of that odious debt in its entirety, and this problem then treated, as it always should have been, as a Europe-wide problem. How can this be done? That's for others to decide. But just as a way was found to impose this debt on us, a way must now be found to lift that burden. On June 25th, and for the 4th time in this campaign, we are again going to Europe, on this occasion to meet with Mr. Istvan Shekeli, and if I'm mispronouncing his name, I apologise, Economic and Financial Affairs Director of the European Commission, an individual now with a huge influence over Irish financial affairs. We will be bringing our own proposals for that bank debt write-off for Ireland, and it's broken into 2 parts. One, to the ECB, write off the €28.1 billion in sovereign bonds currently held by our central bank in lieu of the promissory notes. That's €25 billion for the future notes, plus €3.1 billion for the 2012 note. Those notes were issued in 2010 to cover a flagrant abuse of the Emergency Liquidity Assistance Fund, when €31 billion was pumped into 2 already insolvent institutions. That was Anglo-Irish Bank and Irish Nationwide Building Society, to enable them pay every cent of every outstanding bond they then held. 2. To the ECB, through the ESM, restore to the Irish Exchequer A, the €3.1 billion already destroyed in March 2011 on the basis of those promissory notes. B, the €20.7 billion taken from our National Pension Reserve Fund to bail out those banks. And C, the remaining €12.2 billion or so borrowed from the various emergency funds to bail out the Irish banks. Our argument is based on fundamentals. First, on the injustice of imposing private debt on a sovereign people. And second, and more prosaically, on the basis that one of the root causes of this crisis lies in the creation of the euro itself, a seriously flawed design which carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Included in those flaws was a lack of foresight of what might happen when countries and their banks, which previously had their own currencies and paid a premium to borrow money on the international markets, suddenly found themselves with access to an unlimited supply of cheap billions. A lack of oversight, no one applying the brakes to the destructive and reckless rush of hundreds of billions of euro from the so-called core countries to the periphery, and a lack of any structure in the event of an emergency. Even within Ireland itself, time and again we are told we brought this crisis on ourselves, that we all partied. We didn't. That the housing boom was somehow the fault of the people, as though we wanted to pay several multiples of what our homes were really worth. We're also told that our problems really started with the infamous blanket bank guarantee of September 2008. There are elements of the truth in all of that, enough to sow doubt in the minds of an already guilt-addled people. Ordinary Irish people driving Mercs and Beamers, holiday homes and foreign holidays. Like, who did we think we were? And yes, there was reckless spending, and yes, there was poor investment. But did this cause the banking crisis? Did this cause the euro crisis? No, it did not. The truth, the full truth, is very different. This was a worldwide banking crisis brought on by the reckless and often criminal behaviour of the banks and financial institutions themselves. In Europe, that banking crisis was soon compounded by the currency crisis, the euro itself at the core. Ireland was one of the first countries in the firing line. Lacking any guidelines or structures from Europe, the then Irish government took unilateral action to save its banking system, and thus we got the blanket bank guarantee. That guarantee was ill-advised in every sense, but all of that advice and the subsequent decision hinged on the misinformation that was given by the banks themselves, that theirs was merely a temporary problem of liquidity, when in fact several banks were already insolvent. The EU and the ECB reacted negatively to the guarantee and heavily criticised it, rightly so. But it was issued in an environment where any real advice or direction from either the ECB or the EU was lacking, and the Irish authorities were left on their own to deal with what was an acute crisis. But if we look at the EU-ECB policy since then, regardless of the problems emanating from our guarantee and the EU's negative response to it, from the outset of the crisis, the stated policy of the EU-ECB itself was to bail out every bank and every bondholder. There would be no haircuts, no burden sharing. Instead, there would be a Canute-like effort to hold back the tide, the flood of failed financial investments then diverted to the sovereign. What matter if the common people were swamped, as long as the banks and the other financial institutional gamblers were saved? And so it was that as the years have passed, and as more and more austerity has been piled on the Irish people, bond after failed bond, in bank after failed bank in the Irish system has been paid in full, and continues to be paid in full. That policy, imposed on Ireland by the EU-ECB, flies in the face of all natural justice, and has resulted in a situation where the poorest in society are subsidising the richest, a bailout of the rich by the poor. And by the way, this policy also contradicts EU responses adopted in subsequent bailout packages in Greece and Cyprus. But let's be clear on what we are looking for from Europe. We are not going to Brussels or to Frankfurt with a begging bowl. We are not asking for charity for Ireland. In fact, we're not asking for anything. We are demanding justice. Those of us in what is now known as the Eurozone who signed up to the new currency and all its myriad design flaws share responsibility for the chaos it has caused. We accept that we must also share the cost of repairing that damage. In Ireland, we have been burdened with a massively disproportionate share of that cost. How much? Well, so far, and excluding the contribution from NAMA, which was set up to take over the major bad debts of the Irish banks, the Irish bank bailout has cost the Irish people €64,100,000,000. That's €14,244 per person, or approximately €60,000 per average Irish family. An equivalent amount for Germany would be over €1 trillion. Do you think they tolerate it? Because I don't. Our two proposals will see that burden lifted. The first proposal, the destruction of the bonds now held by the central bank, will give a long-term boost to the Irish economy, and it should ease the justified fears of the money markets about the sustainability of Ireland's debt. And the second proposal, recovering the money already ploughed into the bank bailout, would give this government billions to invest in jobs and thus kickstart the economy back into growth. This is a European problem, and it must have a European solution. And the priority in that solution must be the welfare of the people of Europe, but not, as is currently the case, the welfare of the banks and financial institutions. Warning: the value of your investment may fall as well as rise. Whatever happened to that very basic rule of every financial investment, big or small? The ECB dictated policy of bailing out bondholders wasn't just flying in the face of one of the fundamental rules of capitalism. It was itself a fundamental and monumental error, and it has resulted in the most underprivileged in society paying the price for the mistakes of some of the most overprivileged. An argument incessantly used against us is that it's too late. Paying those bonds, bankers and financial institutions is now a legal obligation. They have legal protection. But we ask, where was our legal protection when this €64.1 billion debt was being foisted on us? Where were our politicians? Where were our headline media commentators when all this was being done? Who was protecting us? Where was the voice of the people? We were told, and we are still being told, that the government had no choice. We ask, when our ruling politicians in this government and the last were doing their risk assessment, when they agreed to imposing debt slavery not just on this generation but on several future generations of their own people, what value did they place on our national hard-won, blood-won freedom and independence? Of our new European rulers we ask, when you are doing all your calculations with those bankers and financiers whispering in your ears about fiscal compacts and fiscal targets, what value do you place on human dignity? What value do you place on the right of citizens to a decent health service, to a decent education, to good food and clean water, to warmth and shelter? What value do you place on the right of citizens to a decent job, a job in which they are not exploited? Who is speaking for the people? In the formation of the European coal and steel community, which was the forerunner of the EU, one of the major objectives was an end to the extreme nationalism that had so pulled Europe apart for centuries. The current policies of the EU are now pulling apart whatever unity had been built up over the last few decades, with entire nations being demonised with more and more polarisation. First, and right now, this has to stop. Then, the EU has to change. We need a new direction. We know we're just a small group, and after 120 weeks of being ignored even by our own media, we know the challenge we face, but we are here and we are not going away. We join our voice to those in Europe who share our concerns. With them, we demand that that which is unjust but was made legal must now be undone completely. Where this bank debt is concerned, we are not interested in a reduction in interest rate or an extension of terms. This bank debt is odious, unjust, and this burden must be lifted. As we prepare now for our meetings with the EC and the ECB, we're asking for support. Support from all our politicians, local, national and European. Support from ICTU and all the individual unions. Support from IBEC and from ISME and from the various chambers of commerce around the country. Support from the various county councils and corporations. Support from our student bodies, secondary and third level. Support from the various sporting bodies. Support from all our exile groups. Support from every organisation across this country who want to see this odious bank debt burden lifted. You can email this support, and groups only please, because we don't want to see Fiona swamped, to fionabuckley@yahoo.com. Thank you, dear Rodolphe.